Honored again to have David Kennedy with us and sharing from his perspective as a healthcare coach and leader in many different ways. David has worked in the healthcare industry and he's been a personal coach, life coach, but also in grief and trauma. And one of the areas that I have found, David, your help was in self-care. And this is an industry when it comes to long-term care and retirement homes that a lot of people, they're giving. It's an industry in which you are programmed to give. You come alongside of people and you help them in their giving, but you also help them to understand the toll and the task and the trauma that actually can bring back to yourself. Well, today we're going to talk about some of that. We're going to talk about some of the challenges and the dangerous side of working in long-term care, retirement care, but especially in the healthcare industry where you're actually giving and giving and giving. And finding ways to do that in a healthy way. So as we start, the pandemic has raised awareness about long-term care and retirement and the challenges in that industry in particular. I know that when we look back, we were front page in a lot of different ways, the long-term care. I think everyone knew that there needed to be some changes in long-term care and retirement, but no one had that push or the energy or whatever it was that needed to happen to make it happen. Well, the pandemic has made it happen, but it's also it's been pretty traumatic for people. What has your experience been in working in the field of healthcare with the workers?
Thanks, Ron. And I've looked forward to our conversation today and the next one. So what we're going to, as you say, kind of look at it in two different ways today. This one really looking at the challenge of what the work does, and next one we'll focus strictly on self-care and that. But there's an ancient quote that I read that said, wisdom came into this world not because it was spoken, but because it was heard. And like certainly we have been hearing more, as you pointed out, the pandemic. We have been listening to what exactly this piece of the pandemic has done and how healthcare has been right on the cusp of that and having to deal with it and respond. And I think we have heard. My hope is that we don't stop hearing, because there is so much that we need to pay attention to. And while the pandemic has indeed highlighted the whole healthcare industry, particularly in long-term care and retirement homes, and the challenges of working in that, I think we need to be hearing a lot better in a broader scope. So I think that one of the messages, and this is kind of the conflicting pieces, is that we're hearing a number of messages out of that. We're hearing on one side the expression of gratitude from people and the incredible way in which that happens. But we're also hearing from the other side from healthcare. And I've worked, as you mentioned, I've been involved in healthcare for a long time and been listening for a long time. And I hope hearing for a long time. And I recognize that what I'm hearing now is not necessarily new, but it's amplified. And my hope is that it will be enough for us as a society to make significant changes and to listen well to what's going on.
You talk about the listening and the hearing, as we take that in, just briefly. Talk about the difference, how they interact a little bit differently. I can listen to people, but what's it mean to really hear?
Right. And real hearing leads to a response in a way that is meaningful. Sometimes, and you're right, sometimes people listen only to finish what's being said so I can say what I want, right? And hearing is that real experience of, I hear you.
Yes.
And that's more than my ears of auditorial. I'm feeling what you're saying. And that's the piece that I'm hoping has come out of this, more than just the headlines. It's that, are we hearing what's going beyond that? Because I think, you know, people who go into this work, you know, I think the work itself is, healthcare people describe it to me as it's hard, but it's meaningful, it's rewarding, it's fulfilling, it's also stressful. Sometimes thankless. And I think, again, what the response that we've had to this has been one of gratitude for frontline workers or healthcare workers. But again, is that gratitude more than words? Does it translate into something that allows the system to take on what it needs to? So often people in this field feel like there isn't a lot of gratitude for what they do, not just from the individuals or the families, but in the wider culture.
There's a sense at times, well, that's what you paid to do. And you know what, you show up, well, of course you show up, you're paid to do that. And as I mentioned, you know, front page news, and as you identify, both sides, like big notices. We love our healthcare workers. Thank you for all that you're doing. And then on the flip side of that, it's all of the tragedies and then the visual of the Army coming in to do the work they weren't, and not even explaining a full story that, well, the Army needed to come in because the staff were sick. They weren't able to show up. And some of them had jobs in other places, and they weren't able to, they had to work in one place or the other. There was so many complex issues that people don't see and don't understand, and yet feel that they have a really good understanding of the whole complex issue. And so,
and the longer it goes on, the less, you know, forgiving or people are of that, right? It's like there's almost this sense of we're reverting back to that invisible side, right? And for a long time they were visible, as you say, the large signs. And I think that in talking with healthcare, I think it's, you know, the signs are again, those, it's not the speaking, it's not the signs that change things. It's the hearing of what those signs are.
And what's needed.
And what's needed that can do that. So, you know, and I think healthcare in general, I think people, you know, people respond to healthcare workers. I mean, we all, if anybody has spent time in the hospital or in need of healthcare, you know, you're grateful. I mean, there's always pieces we can complain about, but the fact that we have access to that and the quality of that. But people go in, I mean, I've heard comments around, you know, you're a special kind of person to do this work, or you know, I couldn't do what you do, or those kinds of things that kind of allow, you know, a healthcare worker to feel like, okay, I do have some place in here. But then the flip side, as you say, is that there's not an understanding of what that work actually means. And that's what some of what I hope we can talk about today is that, you know, what's it mean to be in healthcare, not just during this pandemic time, but what's it actually mean to work in this particular field.
And how does it play out? And that leads to some of the shadow side of the work.
Right.
And the ethical challenges that may arise out of that. And do you want to maybe just touch a little bit on some of that as well?
I think there's a couple of things around the shadow side. I think, it's not unique to this. But I think it provides a uniqueness. So the shadow side of our work in healthcare, often it can occur on two levels. It can be a personal one, where we begin to take the identity of a healthcare worker as defining who we are. So we need, we see ourselves as somebody that may be a martyr. And I think sometimes this pandemic has created that sense where some individuals have really played on that.
Right.
The majority haven't, because it's not something that we do. But it's easy in any of our work. But in healthcare, we can begin to take on that martyrdom or the saint kind of thing.
Right.
Where it leads to is that what happens with that type of shadow is that when the work defines us and we're defined by what we do, then we need other people to see us like we're doing a great job. We need people to need us.
Right.
And there's this cycle that we can get into without recognizing. That's true in any workplace or profession. But I think healthcare, we can find ourselves in a place where we need to be needed, we need to be liked, we need to be right. And so we often find ourselves so wrapped up in that we can become workaholics. We can put ourselves into the work at the expense of other things in life.
When you mention that, I'm thinking, okay, during the pandemic, for 2 years, healthcare workers have been working. And that's been their job, their role, their life. Is basically the last 2 years, I show up to work. And I hear stories about people who are isolated in their homes. But that's not the healthcare worker. And yet this work then starts, if I'm hearing you right, is that it starts to define the way you think. So when you are outside of your workplace, that could create some angst, even in your friendships, your stuff at home,
your relationships,
relationships at home, and forget about Facebook. That's just that's a dynamic that has engulfed a lot of us in both positive and negative. But during this period of time, very, very negative, and we identify not just our work, but we take that into our relationships and our Facebook. So it can polarize as well.
It can get polarizing, get toxic, and it really is difficult on a personal level. And then, it adds the other pieces which you've alluded to, things like compassion fatigue. We could talk about, burnout. We could talk about stresses. And certainly the pandemic has... and again, I want to be clear that the pandemic has amplified. It hasn't created. I think it's amplified.
Because it's been there before.
It's been there, And I think the system has these defaults built into it that create the very same thing. I mean, I've talked to healthcare workers 10 years ago, let's say, around the danger of the shadow side of their work. It's not like it's new, but what things like the pandemic has done has to really amplify that. And I feel so deeply for healthcare workers, trying to manage, as you say, the rigors of this work.
Well, you've mentioned ethical dissonance before. And is that something that you might want to, in terms of the ethical challenge?
Well, I think I'd like to begin in the broader side of that because,
Okay.
I think it's part of the work we do in healthcare
Right.
that presents that. And again, what has happened in the pandemic, it's simply amplified that.
Right.
So I like to think of it this way, Ron. I think about it in a series of concentric circles.
Right.
So let's talk about this first circle. And who's in that first circle are the client or the patient,
Right.
their family, their immediate family, and their extended family, perhaps, who are connected. In some cases, it's not family, but it's those who are responsible for them. So they may not have family, but they may have friends that are power of attorney or whatever.
Right.
So they're the ones that are responsible for their care.
Right.
Then the next circle out, which I'll call second circle, are the people who look after them. So all of us connected in that, which can be healthcare professionals,
Right.
it can be volunteers, it can be administrative people who interact with them.
Right.
It can be the dietary people who serve meals. It can be all those people who aren't in that first circle.
Right.
They're not responsible for the decision making, other than the healthcare pieces.
Right.
But we interact with them. So nurses, PSWs, on a daily basis are developing this connection,
Yes.
this relationship.
Yes.
And the truth is, as you know, that often, and I can't say a percentage, but
Right.
in my experience, many times, those people in second circle actually have a closer relationship with that person than many in the first circle.
Right.
However, second circle people don't have the ability, due to legal things, due to whatever issues, to make decisions around things in that first circle.
Right.
So often the ethical pieces come into play when decisions are made by people in that first circle.
Right.
And we're out here in the second circle saying,
Yes.
that's not right. You know,
Yes.
why are they allowed to do that?
Right.
Why are they making that person do that?
Right.
But I can't make that decision. I don't have the authority.
Right.
But I have an ethical dilemma and sometimes it comes from that first circle.
Right.
Sometimes it comes from outside too, that says, you know what, you have to do this. This is our policy. You have to do this.
Right.
And you've developed a relationship with that person knowing, well, you know what? They don't want their supper at 6 o'clock. They want their supper at 4:30. That's when they need it. Right. And so you try to make those things, and you can't, because the system is at odds with you.
Right.
So it may turn into an ethical dilemma, but it might just be a confrontation with a system. But there are pieces about the person that we are caring for, where it really does become an ethical issue.
Right.
And my ethical pieces are different. So what do we do with that?
Right.
How do we deal with that dissonance?
Well, and the inside circle, so you've got your power of attorney, you've got family members, but often in that circle are family members who disagree with each other.
Oh, absolutely.
And that often can get pretty heated at times as well. And you're trusting that they're both feel that they're coming from the best interest of the loved one.
Right.
Sometimes, though, all of us get a little mixed up in what is the best interest of the loved one, or what is our interpretation or our own personal feeling gets mixed in there, and it's about us sometimes making decisions for our loved ones that we think are best. And this last 2 years, it's been huge. I want to take my loved one home for the weekend, but if you do, it may
lose your spot.
That's right, or get COVID, right? So and they end up losing their life, over the thing. that's from our perspective in looking at it and saying, well, there are controls that we have in place here. But those controls also create that other ethical issue where we see them looking at one, we're looking at the resident now who doesn't have that family connection like they once did.
Right.
And that has created a tremendous amount of ethical challenge, because we all know that is important and it's essential to the resident and family members, but it puts them at a greater risk during a pandemic.
Yeah.
Now, thank goodness we're moving away from the severity with some of the vaccinations and other things that we have in place of this pandemic, so that we are now engaging with family and that. But during that time, the ethical challenge.
And have we learned anything? I mean, I think you're right. We're moving away, but are we learning out of that ways? Because again, I think what the you're going to be tired of me saying that, but the amplification factor of the pandemic has only demonstrated what was there before.
I agree.
And so, even what you mentioned around family members in that first circle, sometimes they disagree about the care of that person.
Right.
But also, and sometimes we're watching and we're saying, I don't trust your motive.
Right.
Like, what are your motives for the decisions you're making?
Right.
And this is where the ethical pieces get into it. And the truth is that if somebody has been in long-term care for a length of time, the staff probably do know and understand that person the way they are now better than even family.
Of course.
So family often, their knowledge of people is based on their experience of them up until this point. So and that's absolutely valuable. And there's pieces of that don't change. Oh my gosh, I'm not suggesting that. But life, for somebody who's been in long-term care for a longer period of time, sometimes the changes that happen, the desires, the wants, the wishes. It's the staff that understand that probably better sometimes.
And their abilities.
And their ability. Their ability to do this or that. So where we get into the ethical pieces is when we clash with that. When somebody comes in who hasn't been, and again, you're right, the pandemic has kept families out. So when they return, I'm expecting that we're probably going to see some more challenges. So my words to a healthcare worker is, first of all, of understanding and saying, okay, it's all right. Let's recognize those differences. And we can recognize them and then maybe talk to somebody to see about, what do we do with that? But we also know that I'm in second circle. So at the end of the day, I'm not in that first circle. So and if we can't get to that place, then we're going to find ourselves in what I will call this a bit of misguided ethical dilemma where we're trying to impose what we can't really impose. So I would look for other ways to influence, and I'm going to use the word influence, rather than to directly try to change what we can't change.
I've heard Darla, my wife, so often. She's worked in this industry for years, and extremely compassionate and empathetic, but and with a broad understanding of what it is to be a nurse, but in every other area as well, in the industry. She keeps reminding me by just simply saying, well, did you ask the resident? Did you ask the person themselves? What is it that you would like? How are you feeling about this? What would this create for them, and then coaching the families and loved ones how to do that as well, and that's that always sort of rings in the back of my mind.
Well, and Ron, that is so important. And I think the danger of all of us in healthcare is that we forget that every individual we're working with is a full human being.
Right.
That deserves the right.
Yeah.
So I'll tell you a story about that. One of my clients, and he died about 1.5 years ago now, but he lived with ALS, which was, as you know, a very debilitating and degenerative disease.
Right.
This man, I used to visit him. To the last year of his life, I visited almost weekly.
Right.
And he was this philosopher. I learned so much from him.
Right.
Anyway, he lost his ability to walk very early. He was in a wheelchair. It was a motorized wheelchair.
Right.
He had the use of his left arm and hand, and then that was gone. And the day that he lost his ability to use his left hand, his fingers, he lost the ability to use his motorized wheelchair.
Yeah.
We eventually did get him a laser thing, but there was a period of time where he was totally dependent on others.
Right.
So he told me one day about a healthcare worker who came in, and it was a new person and young, and they said to him, "Oh, I'm going to move you over here by the window because it's a great day and you'll have fun looking out the window." And he said to her, "I don't want to sit by the window. I want to sit over here on the other side of the room."
Right.
And she said, "Oh no, you'll like it here by the window."
Oh wow! Yes,
and so she had the power. He had no control.
Right.
So she pushed him over to the window and left him there.
Oh my!
While she went and did her work.
Oh
now,
my!
I'd like to. I know that's not the majority. I mean, but all I'm saying is we can. That's the shadow side of our work when we feel like we have the decision-making powers over how people do things.
Right.
So what Darla's saying to you is absolutely true.
Right.
Let's begin with, what do you want? Now, when the family's in that inner circle and they're making decisions without asking, there's our ethical dilemma too, right? Like, and should we step in and say to family, is it possible that maybe you want to ask mom or dad?
Right.
Rather than, so those are the challenges.
So you're saying ask as opposed to being directive, right?
I think for two reasons. One, directness is going to create more conflict. Right. And two, at the end of the day, we have to find a way to get them to do what's right.
Yes.
But those are, that's part of the healthcare pieces that wears on you. I mean, nurses, PSWs, RNs, RPNs, people who watch this day in, day out, you have to know that they go home with that angst. So what do they do with those pieces? And that's the piece. We'll talk about some self-care next time. But I want to point out and make it very clear because, again, these are some of the things I've heard.
Right.
But I don't think it's new. I think people have been speaking it for a long time, but we haven't been listening. We haven't been hearing what they're saying. And I think it's time to recognize that those challenges in healthcare do have implications for our healthcare workers. And the pandemic has amplified that piece, but it didn't begin with this. It was there in the way in which the work itself does those things.
So thank you for sharing with us today, and I'm looking forward to our next session.